This is Steve.
And this is Shawn.
This is Acro Media's High Five.
So, Steve, what are we talking about?
We're going to be talking about technical debt.
That's depressing.
It is. I was kind of thinking of like how I could make that into like a mic drop, but it's really not one of those types of things.
You just burst into tears afterwards. We're going to talk about technical debt, and it's awful.
Yeah. And technical debt is actually was something I used to have a hard time selling because I had a hard time explaining it, and I had a hard time explaining why it was something useful or beneficial to the client. Because it oftentimes seems...
Well, I mean, it isn't. It's very bad.
Yeah. Well, it kind of is, right? But it's the idea that you've continued to develop over time to a point where you have accumulated almost, bad code or code that is no longer helping your website, right? Mm-hmm. And this is pretty normal when you eventually, you develop an MVP or minimal viable product, you go to market with it, and as you add on to your product or to your website, it gets to a point where if you could have re-architected the whole thing, you would have built it differently. Yeah, it's kind of like a Lego analogy in a way, right? And you're kind of building up, but it was never in the original plans, and so the architecture becomes weak over time. The thing is that explaining, the time to go into it, that I always found to be a challenge, as to explain exactly what are you doing when
what
you
say...
What
do I get if I buy you fixing my technical debt?
I can explain that part, right? It makes sense. The client understands. It's like, okay.
What new features do I get? What will be different?
And nothing. But what are the types of okay, so let's talk a little bit of what happens if they don't do it. Let's talk a little bit of why they should do it. So why don't you start with that?
And even so, we said what don't you don't get anything. That's not really true.
Okay.
Right? Do you get like a fancy new feature? No. Do you get fewer bugs? Yes. Do you get faster development time? Yes.
Okay.
You get those things, right?
Like an oil change to a certain extent, or not an oil change, but it's you're tweaking, fixing your vehicle.
Yeah, it's some of that. It's almost the debt one is fairly apt, right? It's like, what do you get by paying down your debt? Nothing. You already live in the house. You already own the car. Whatever.
You're simply not, paying higher payments.
What you're doing is you're getting rid of it so you won't have payments.
That's right.
And you're not accruing more debt.
Yeah.
Right? Which gets worse and worse and worse, and then you drown in it, basically, right?
Is that hitting a little nerve there for you?
I don't have debt problems. Technical debt problems is like a constant problem. I don't have financial debt problems.
That we know of.
Yeah. They're mostly illegal, so I can't really talk about them.
Technical debt, though.
Yeah. It's that. It's this thing. It's like paying down debt is not fun or whatever, but paying it off, or not having it, that is great, right? Like that is like a real stress relief.
Okay. Well, how do we get rid of it?
And so how we get rid of it is, you fix those things that you want to change. So we had a feature, and then we added 3 more features, and then we say, okay, now that we have these 4 features, if we take the base and we actually re-architect it, we can remove 800 lines of code, right? Because we can make one common base here. So now instead of maintaining 4 individual features, we're mostly maintaining one core feature.
One feature of those 4 items.
And then a few small pieces of customization.
Yeah.
So if we want to add a 5th one, it's really easy. We don't have to copy a whole bunch and change it. We just add a new little bit.
Yep.
If we have to fix a bug, it's probably just in this one piece.
Yep.
So fixing bugs are easier. Bugs are less likely to exist because there's one place instead of 4. Adding the new feature is easier. Yep. So you get all that advantage, but it means but the initial bit of re-architecting that part doesn't get you anything right then and there. It gets you stuff in future work.
If you stay on top of technical debt, is it ever a huge cost, or is it something that is pretty feasible?
It's very feasible, and it's easier if you stay on top of it. It is like any debt. It gets worse if you leave it, right? Because so if say I have those 4 things and then I consolidate them down into one, that's a bit of work. If I have 15 things and I let it get that big, and now I have to consolidate them down, that's a much bigger deal.
I'm like totally focusing on your hands right now. It's like
I'm
not even looking at you anymore.
We'll have to get some sweet graphics to show that or whatever. I'm a kinetic, learner or whatever.
I see that.
It's the more you let it go, the bigger the job is or whatever. The bigger the repair job, the maintenance job is. Whereas if you do the little bit of maintenance all the time and you never let it get too out of hand, Yeah, little bits of maintenance. It's very maintainable, but it is that, say we're doing, 30 hours worth of improvements, maybe we're doing 5 hours of fixing technical debt, right?
Okay.
Every time. But and where that gets into a problem is like we have a 30-hour feature, but we only have 30 hours in our sprint, and we want to do 5 hours of technical debt cleanup.
Got it.
Suddenly
the
part
debt,
gets,
we don't need that.
We'll get that next time, right?
Yeah.
But then
That's always the next
yeah.
time.
And then suddenly I got 30 hours worth of debt, and I have to do a whole sprint on that, but I need features to go out. I got a product launching it.
Well, you could do that though too, right? You could just do actual technical debt sprint. You could, as much as it makes sense to say, hey, let's make sure we do 5 hours of technical debt cleanup to stay on top of something.
And it might not always be a little bit that you can do 5 hours. You might do a few sprints and you're like, okay, now that we look back at it, we didn't know at the time, but now we should actually redo this whole part. That's a 25-hour thing or whatever, right? It can be like that because oftentimes what it is it's not that. Sometimes it's just that you program something poorly, but oftentimes it was fine at the time.
Yeah.
And then as you've gone along and you've added more features, you realize it could be changed, or clients have had different, or customers have had different needs, and they've been like, oh, actually, we need to do this. And you're like, oh, but it can't really do that very well.
Yeah.
But if we change it, then it can do this, or actually I can remove this down, or there's a new piece of functionality that I can use. There's a new feature to my language, or there's a new library that's available, so I'm going to re-architect this and pull a piece out or something.
Then my last question would be, when we go to do technical debt, you mentioned re-architecting something, and you have the use cases of, it was supposed to do X, Y, Z. Maybe at the time, you didn't know, but over time it needs to evolve and change. What exactly are we doing when we say we're re-architecting something? What does that mean?
Oftentimes we're consolidating things, moving pieces around, changing how stuff works. So one thing can be there's a simple thing, it's kind of a programming mantra. They'd say basically sort of a rule of 3 thing. Okay. So if you do something once, there's no point in abstracting it out into a reusable function, because if you never end up using it again, that work was pointless or whatever, right? If you use it 2 times, it's probably still not worth it. Once you use it 3 times, now you should abstract it out, right? It's kind of a rule of thumb. It's not a hard and fast thing, but it's a general idea. So once you get to 3, you're like, okay, I'm using this enough now that it would be more effective for me to make a central shared thing that I can use for these 3 pieces. So that's one thing you can do. Sometimes it's maybe I had those 3 things, or maybe I had, like you said, X, Y, Z. Maybe Y and Z I don't use anymore.
Got it.
Right? But they're still in the code, right? And so if someone's looking at it, they're confusing because the person sees this functionality and is like,
they're no longer,
do I need to fix this? But then it turns out it's not used, where they're worrying about bugs or things like that, and that needs to go, we don't use that anymore, get rid of it, right? And so it's cleaning up things that we don't use anymore. Maybe we support an old type of product that we haven't sold in 4 years or whatever. We have a whole bunch of code for that. Get rid of that, right? Because it's just adding more what they call cruft kind of in programming, which is sort of extra junk in the code that you don't need anymore. So it's all these sort of various little cleanup things that make the code. Basically, what you want to do is you want to make it smaller and simpler anytime you can. Simple code is good code. Complex code is bad code. So if you have a complex piece and you can make it simpler, it sounds really easy. It's actually sometimes really hard. The best code is super simple, but it's not always easy to make that simple code. Sometimes you have to be really good developers can make really simple
I think
code.
sometimes that was a weird thing where some people think that more code sometimes means good. I know as a developer that makes you cringe. Right, but it does kind of have that opinion around it, whereas actually simpler, more streamlined code is actually better.
The most functionality with the simplest code, and it doesn't mean less of just name your variables really short and cram it all together, but the cleaner, the more basic it can be, the easier it is to read, the easier it is to maintain, the less likely bugs can do it. That's really, if you look at bad code, usually that's what it is. It's overly complex. It has parts that are not needed. It uses extra variables. It has extra logic that could be contained. There might be a system where, say, we loop through a bunch of products, and then we loop through a bunch of products again, and then we search through products again, and we could actually all combine them and go through them only once and do a couple of concise things. Now I took 3 things, I moved them into one thing. It's more clear. I've just removed code, and I have not removed any functionality.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about, but I do remember hearing this or talking to you about this is reducing technical debt. Does it not speed up and help with performance as well?
Yeah, I mean, it helps with speed in almost all aspects. Speed of development, usually performance of the code, because almost all performance optimizations happen afterwards. It's really hard to optimize performance at the start. You have to kind of build stuff, see how it runs, and then kind of go back and fix the performance. They call it basically premature optimization if you try to optimize something you haven't even finished building yet, because you're probably optimizing the wrong parts.
Got it.
And so anytime you can clean up those pieces, it might be like that example I said where you loop through 3 times. Not only does that clean up the code, but that's probably going to go, at 1/3 the speed or the 1/3 the amount of time it used to take.
Yeah.
Because looping through all those things is a very slow process. And so if we can do the 3 actions we want to do in one set, instead
Nice
of
use of
3
hands, though.
sets,
You're already improving.
I know, in frame, right? Hopefully, you've got a performance speed improvement, and you probably weren't even doing performance work then. You were just doing code cleanup, and you'll get performance there. It's usually you get memory improvements too, because you're like, hey, I actually don't need these 4 variables, I only need 2, and you clean those up and go through. It's almost always the way to do performance. If I do a performance audit for anything, that's the first thing I do, because usually that both helps you fix performance automatically, plus then now you can actually see where the performance problems are. The simpler and the cleaner you make the code. Whereas if it's really complex, you don't even know where the bad parts are.
Got it. So with all that said, what's our TLDR?
You should fix your technical debt so you don't drown or big men come and break your knees.
Yeah, there's that. The big men breaking knees, that sounds like the worst thing we could actually ask for. Regarding technical debt, if you have any questions about that, throw them down below. Subscribe to our channel. If you actually want financial help too, I'm sure Shawn can help you. No, he probably can't help you.
I am not a financial advisor.
Hit us up on LinkedIn. What's your Twitter?
First, you got to follow us on Facebook, or you can check out our blog at acromedia.com, or you can follow me on Twitter.
You could reverse that.
No, never.